The late summer sun beat down on the small town of Willow Creek, its rays stretching long and golden across the wide Wyoming prairie, where the air carried the mingled scents of dust, horse sweat, and the faint perfume of wild sage drifting from the hills. The town itself was nothing more than a scattering of clapboard buildings, a general store with a wide front porch shaded by a tin roof, a blacksmith shop that rang all day with the sound of hammer striking iron, a church steeple that stood proudly even though its white paint peeled, and a saloon with swinging doors that creaked every time some weary cowboy stumbled inside. And down the narrow street of hard-packed dirt walked Clara May Dalton, her hands wrapped tightly around a worn leather satchel, her face pale but her chin lifted high as if daring anyone to meet her gaze. Clara had once been the preacher's daughter, raised in respectability, her voice once part of the choir that filled Sunday mornings with hymns, her name once spoken in admiration for her beauty and her kindness. But all that had changed with one cruel mistake, one misplaced trust in a man who whispered promises of marriage and left her instead with a ruined reputation and nothing to her name. In the months since, Clara had endured the slow, merciless exile of gossip, the looks of scorn from women who once called her sister, the pitying stares of men who would never offer honest courtship. When her parents had passed not long after, taken by a fever, she had been left utterly alone, with no roof over her head, no kin to turn to, and no future except the ache of surviving another day in a town that had already condemned her. It was as she passed the general store, her steps quick, her eyes fixed on the horizon, that she felt the weight of a gaze upon her, steady, unyielding, and unlike the usual judgment she had grown accustomed to. She turned her head and saw Luke Carver standing across the street, a man as solid and weathered as the land itself, his broad frame marked by years of labor on the ranch, his face rugged beneath the shadow of his hat, and his gray eyes fixed intently on her as though he saw more than the gossip could ever tell. Luke had been a widower for 2 years, a man who carried sorrow like an invisible brand on his soul, yet he had kept moving forward for the sake of his 2 little girls, Mary and Hannah, who depended on him for everything. He was not often in town, preferring the wide solitude of his ranch, but when he did appear, people spoke to him with respect, for his honesty, his work ethic, and the quiet authority that came from a life of toil. That day, though, he was not in Willow Creek for supplies or cattle trade. He had come for something heavier, something that had been weighing on his mind for weeks as he watched his daughters grow lonelier, hungrier for a mother's gentle presence that he, no matter how hard he tried, could not provide. He stepped off the wooden walkway with the deliberate tread of a man who had already made up his mind, his boots stirring the dust as he crossed the street. "Miss Dalton," he called softly, his voice carrying over the creak of wagon wheels and the chatter of townsfolk. Clara froze mid-step, her heart tightening, for it had been a long time since any man had spoken her name without sneer or mockery. She turned slowly, her blue eyes wary, her lips parting slightly as she looked up at him. "Mr. Carver," she said, her tone cautious, unsure why the respected widower rancher would stop her here in broad daylight. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Life on the ranch had taught him plain speaking, and he saw no reason to disguise his purpose now. "I know you've fallen on hard times," he said, his gaze steady, "and I know what folks in this town say about you. But I've never put much stock in gossip. What matters to me is truth, and the truth is this: I've got 2 little girls at home who need a mother's care, and you need a home. So I'm asking you plain, be my wife, Clara. It won't be fancy, but it'll be honest. You'll have shelter, food, and a place where you belong. And my girls will have someone to guide them again." The words struck her like a thunderclap, leaving her stunned, her breath caught in her throat. Marriage. To Luke Carver. A man of respect, a man who could have his choice of any number of widows or lonely women willing to marry a rancher. She searched his face, looking for mockery, for pity, for some hidden cruelty, but she found only steady sincerity in his eyes. I don't understand," she whispered, clutching her satchel tighter as if it were a lifeline. "You would marry me, knowing what the town says. Knowing I've got no dowry, no name worth holding onto anymore." Luke's jaw tightened, his voice calm but resolute. "Clara, I don't need money. I don't need a spotless reputation. What I need is someone with kindness left in her heart, someone who can hold my girls when they cry at night, someone who can bring light back into a house that's been too quiet for too long. I reckon you've still got that kindness. I reckon you could be what they need." Her heart pounded wildly, torn between disbelief and a desperate longing she had nearly buried. For so long, she had convinced herself that her life was over, that no man would look past her mistake, that she was destined to fade into obscurity. And yet here stood Luke Carver, offering her not just shelter, but a chance to be needed, to belong, to start anew. "I don't know if I'm what your girls need," she whispered, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, the raw vulnerability of her voice betraying her fear. Luke's gaze softened, though his words remained firm. "Miss Dalton, I don't need perfect. My girls don't need perfect. They need someone who will love them as best she can, day by day. I think you can do that." The prairie wind swirled around them, carrying the faint smell of horses and hay, and the town seemed to hold its breath, though no one else was paying much mind to the pair standing in the middle of the street. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She could walk away, continue her lonely wandering, face another night without a bed, another morning with no purpose. Or she could take his hand, step into a life she had never imagined, and perhaps find redemption in the very place where she had once been cast out. Slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish, she lifted her chin and met his steady gaze. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling but sure, "I'll be your wife." Luke's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in a long while, a flicker of relief crossed his face. He tipped his hat slightly, the gesture both respectful and quietly triumphant. "Then it's settled," he said simply. "We'll speak to the preacher tomorrow. My girls will be glad to meet you." Clara stood there for a moment longer, stunned by the swiftness of it all, but deep in her chest a spark of something she hadn't felt in months began to glow, hope, fragile but real. As Luke walked beside her, leading her toward a future neither of them had fully dared to dream, Clara realized that sometimes the most unexpected proposals were not just bargains of necessity, but the first steps toward healing hearts that had long been broken. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky streaked in soft pinks and gold, the prairie stretching endless beneath the rising sun, and Clara awoke with a heart both heavy and light, for though the vows would be simple and spoken in front of only a handful of witnesses, they carried with them the weight of a lifetime of change, and as she smoothed the skirt of the borrowed calico dress she wore, she wondered if she would truly be enough for the life awaiting her. The church bells tolled quietly, and the preacher, who had known her father well, looked at her with a measure of compassion as he led her to the front, where Luke Carver stood steady and unshaken, his hat held respectfully in his hands, his face solemn but not without gentleness. Clara's heart pounded as she met his gaze, but his eyes gave nothing but reassurance, as though he was telling her without words that he did not regret this choice, that he would not falter in it, and so she spoke her vows with a voice trembling but true, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, she felt both a weight lift and a new one settle, for now she belonged not only to herself but to a family that would depend on her. The townsfolk present, few though they were, whispered, some skeptical, others curious, but Luke did not seem to hear, and Clara, though her cheeks flushed, lifted her chin and walked out on his arm, determined that if the world doubted her, she would prove herself not with words but with the life she would build on that ranch. The ride out to the Carver homestead was long and dusty, the wagon creaking under the weight of supplies and her small satchel tucked beside her, and Clara sat beside Luke in silence for much of the way, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and fragile hope. Luke did not press her with chatter, instead, he let the quiet of the open plains settle between them, the kind of silence that felt more like acceptance than neglect, and Clara found comfort in it, for it seemed to say he would not demand more than she could give. When at last they crested a hill and the ranch came into view, Clara felt her breath catch. The Carver homestead stretched wide beneath the sky, a sturdy two-story house of weathered wood with smoke curling from its chimney, a barn with red paint faded from years of sun, corrals where a handful of horses grazed, and beyond, endless acres of golden grass and cattle moving slow in the distance. It was not grand, but it was solid, the kind of place built with sweat and love, and Clara felt a stirring of awe that this would be her home. As they rolled into the yard, two little figures appeared on the porch, one taller and reserved, the other small and curious, their eyes wide as they peered at the woman who had arrived beside their father. Luke halted the wagon and lifted his hand in greeting. "Mary, Hannah," he called, his voice carrying a note of warmth she had not heard in town. "Come meet your new ma." The older girl, Mary, perhaps 8 years old, clutched the porch railing and hesitated, her dark eyes wary beneath the tumble of brown curls that framed her face, while little Hannah, no more than 4, toddled forward with open curiosity, her thumb tucked halfway into her mouth as she gazed at Clara. Clara's heart swelled painfully at the sight, and before Luke could help her down, she stepped from the wagon herself, dust rising around her skirts as she knelt on the ground so she would not tower over the children. "Hello, darlings," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentleness she had once used with her younger siblings long ago. "I'm Clara, and I'm very glad to be here with you." Hannah blinked, then took a few steps forward, her small hand reaching out hesitantly before landing on Clara's fingers, and the contact nearly undid her, for it was a wordless gift of trust she had not expected. Mary, however, held back, her lips pressed tight, suspicion etched in the set of her shoulders, and Clara knew then that winning her love would not be easy, but she silently promised herself she would try with every ounce of patience she possessed. Inside the house, Clara quickly discovered the work that awaited her, a kitchen neat but plain, with shelves half empty, clothes in need of mending stacked by the hearth, lessons for Mary scattered unfinished on the table, and the air carrying a silence that felt heavy, the kind that spoke of absence, of a woman's touch long missing. She tied on an apron and set herself to work, preparing supper with the modest supplies at hand, her hands remembering the motions of chopping vegetables, kneading dough, stirring pots, though it had been months since she last cooked in a home of her own. Luke watched her quietly from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, and when at last the table was set and the girls seated, the simple meal tasted like a feast after so many lonely days of hunger. Hannah giggled at a silly story Clara told about a bird she once chased through a field, and though Mary did not laugh, Clara caught the flicker of interest in her eyes, a sign that perhaps the wall around her heart was not impenetrable. That night, after the girls had been tucked into their small beds, Clara lingered in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes by lamplight, when Luke joined her by the fire. For a long time, neither spoke, the only sound the crackle of the flames and the faint whistle of the wind through the eaves. At last, Luke cleared his throat and said quietly, "You've done more in one day than I managed in months." The girls, they laughed tonight. "It's been a long time since I heard that." His voice carried a rough edge of gratitude, and Clara felt her throat tighten. "I was so certain I had no worth left," she confessed, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "So certain my life was over, that all I could do was drift like a shadow no one wanted. But here, with them, with you, it feels like maybe I still have something to give." Luke's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. "You do, Clara," he said simply, the weight of his words steady as stone. "More than you know." The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that deepened the lines of grief but also revealed the quiet strength beneath, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had little to do with the flames. Outside, the coyotes lifted their haunting cries to the moon, but inside the ranch house, there was a fragile sense of belonging taking root, as though the walls themselves exhaled relief at the return of a woman's care. Clara knew the road ahead would not be easy, that Mary's guarded heart would take time to win, that the ranch work would test her, that the whispers in town would not soon fade, but for the first time in months, she did not feel like an outcast drifting toward oblivion. She felt like a wife, a mother, a woman given a second chance not by chance alone but by the quiet courage of a man who saw beyond her scars. And though their marriage had begun as necessity, a bargain of shelter and need, Clara sensed deep in her heart that it held within it the seeds of something more enduring, something neither of them had dared to dream again. The promise of love, fragile as dawn, but growing stronger with every breath they took beneath the wide Wyoming sky.